So, Igneous Rocks Part 3, Intrusive Structures. So, not all igneous sources, not all magmas that rise toward the surface make it all the way out and become lava, or even explosive cinders and debris coming from volcanoes. Some make it partway and then end up cooling on the inside still of the earth, still deep within the earth, still surrounded by other rocks. So, thinking back to the introduction to igneous rocks, you can think that these are likely to have more phaneritic textures because they're insulated by rock as they're coming up, and they cool more slowly. They they have very specific shapes that we'll talk about. They they can be of various sorts, and we'll start to sort these and think about it. Now, we get to see these because even though they solidify into rock well under the surface in a lot of cases, weathering, which we'll get to in a later unit, weathering tends to expose them so that we can see them and start to, well, I can take my rock hammer out there and start to sample them. We can mine them for minerals. A lot of our mineral resources come from intrusive igneous structures that we can mine, especially pegmatites. And the Johnson text has this nice figure in section 4.1 where it lays out a bunch of different intrusive structures altogether, and even some extrusive ones there. You see the volcanoes. But we'll talk about a lot of these different kinds of structures here. So one of the big distinctions, or one of the big classifications we'll make with these, is whether they are concordant or discordant. And what we're talking about here is, notice the other layering. So these stripes here are supposed to represent just the basic horizontal layering of all the other rocks that are there. And really, this is another one of those chicken and egg scenarios. I would like to have talked about the sedimentary layering before we got to the igneous, but then there's plenty of the igneous stuff that I needed to have talked about before we get to the sedimentary. So just remember, when we do talk about the horizontal layering with the sedimentary rocks, that this is what it was referencing. So they are mostly horizontal and flat lying, and then you can have intrusions that basically just cut straight across that horizontal layering, and that's going to be discordant, as opposed to the scenario where you have something form like this along with that original bedding. These do that. They're concordant. They follow the bedding that's already there. So that's going to be a major difference. And we're going to look at some of these different types over here going through the next few slides. So dikes, I guess there's usage of, I grew up hearing the term dike used as like not exactly a dam. Dikes are generally more along the sides of a river instead of like holding one back to make a reservoir. So, but sort of dam-like, and I think that's how. I think that's where the terminology snuck over into igneous types. So in the Johnson figure here, B is showing a dike right there. It comes in, and note that it has a surface expression too right across there. So these are sheet-like discordant intrusions. And it's kind of what they look like in outcrop. So remember, these are weathered down. This is in Zimbabwe, and you can see that's looking down on it from, I don't know if we're really high aircraft or low satellite here, but this is a dike that runs straight across here, and you can see the ground surface has weathered down to where this intrusion started, and we can see that long section like that. Now here it is in a road outcrop in Arizona, and you can see it just cuts straight across the other layering that's there, and it kind of stands up as if it would hold back something on one side. So that's a dike. on the other hand, a sill is concordant. So E, the thing's labeled E here with this is again the Johnson figure, the E here and here. See how these guys are following the planes of rock that are already there instead of cutting across it. So that's what we're talking about with concordant versus discordant. And here's a sill. And so you can see that that out there in the real world of geology, when we say that it follows the layering, we're not saying perfectly. You can tell that this kind of tore up the layering as it got in between there, so it's not perfect, right? But this is an example of a sill. These guys are also going to be sheet-like, but this time now they're on their side, kind of following along the bedding instead of cutting across it. So our sills, E, were these nice emplacements in between the beds, but now a laccolith is a concordant, so it follows the bedding, but it's kind of like a sill that got off the chain here. So see what's going on with this? We have a sill emplacement along the bedding, but it's just so aggressive that it's pushing up the overlying strata above it, and you get this kind of structure right here. And so you've got the strata still here, but then underneath is this intrusive body that followed the bedding but pushed it up to make room. So, of course, recall that we're dealing with intrusives here. So everything in this section, we're talking about rock that cooled and solidified underneath the ground, well insulated from the surface. So think about this vent coming up right here to the top of the volcano, where F is labeled on that image. So that is your lava vent. It's magma from below coming up to become lava when it gets out at the surface. Well, eventually this volcano is going to grow old, and it's going to stop getting supplied with as much magma from below. And so what's here in this vent is going to start to cool and crystallize. And if it does, then it had a longer history of warm magma in it. It might be more mafic. It might have some different character in it, and it might be different than. I mean, it looks like what they've got drawn here is a stratovolcano, so it might be quite different than some of the ash layers and stuff around it, and it might form a very hard core in that dormant or extinct volcano. Well, now we'll come along and weather this surface over millions and millions of years. That's what this diagram is going to show here. You have weathering of this original surface down to this leftover core. And that is how you get a neck or a pipe. It's called various things, but it's relic of the interior structure of that volcano once it's weathered down around it. It's called differential weathering, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the sedimentary structures section. Okay, and so we're talking about as the volcanic environment ages, as it gets older and we run out of magma. So this is our big magma source down here, right? Well, eventually it's going to stop getting supplied, and it's going to start to cool and solidify also, maybe crystallize, probably crystallize since it's an intrusive. So it's going to turn into rock as well. And then, just like with the previous one, you can weather away all this stuff from the top and expose parts of this down here. And so when you do that, see these guys standing around this stock here. So you can see kind of a magma chamber look to it there. And it's solidified rock, probably with a phaneritic texture. If we could zoom in on it, we can't, but if we could probably see the individual crystals and stuff. It's been exposed. Now, the only difference with a stock, what we're going to talk about next, a batholith, is scale. So note the scale here with these guys in the picture. Okay, and now you have the same idea with the same shape down here, not even labeled differently on the diagram, but look at the scale difference. If you notice right there, that's your carving on the front of Stone Mountain down near Atlanta. So this giant as opposed to that stock in the last picture, right? This giant piece here, same sort of shape. It is a solidified magma chamber, crystallized magma chamber, and in fact, the Stone Mountain particularly is a really nice. There was a pun there, but it's a really nice version of a granite, and you can find the typical minerals that we would expect: plagioclases, feldspars, quartz, and biotite. If you go hike around at Stone Mountain, and it's one big piece of granite, and sometimes it's also called a pluton. By the way, some of the vocabulary crosses over, and it depends on who you ask as to which term they're going to use. And I'm probably guilty of using some of these terms interchangeably without realizing it. Might say batholith one time, pluton another time, and they do mean the same thing in this sense. All right, well that does it for intrusive structures. I mean, I'm certainly not finding every different kind of intrusive structure we possibly could, but I think this gets you the basic ideas, how all these different kinds of shapes can turn into rock bodies. Next, we're going to talk about the individual rocks and how we're going to classify them in Lecture D.